members and who've been out in the field covering these tragedies, covering these shootings in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay. And, they expressed a need for connection and reflection and really just, being together to think about some of these issues that surfaced. And so we thought about, well, should we do like a mental health event through our health justice series? But then our board member and vice president of programming, senior vice president of programming, Teresa Watanabe, did the work of pulling together this wonderful reporters roundtable after connecting with Natasha Chen and Josie Huang and Cindy Chang and Jung Park and Summer Lin and Ann Doe and others who had been covering this issue in this story, this breaking news. And so, welcome. We have Jaira Deng, who's live tweeting the session. So if you want to follow her, or share your thoughts on Twitter, that's an option. And then in our chat, Ann Doe, as I mentioned, is moderating. You'll get a chance at during the second half of the program to ask questions. So you can put those questions as they surface in the Q&A or in the chat, and we can kind of bring them up during the Q&A. So to get started, let's actually first, before we meet our moderator and our panelists, let's give you a quick taste of some of the work that they've done to give you a sense of how they've been covering this, what the work that they've done in the field. And, oh, okay. So these are our panelists and we'll meet them in a minute, but first let's see their work. So first of all, you see on the call a number of the reporters who contributed to this amazing work, that the coverage from the LA Times, story after story, looking into, first the breaking news aspect of it, and then reflecting on some of the issues, cultural and community issues that surfaced. And this story, 3 California mass shootings forced grieving Asian Americans to ask painful questions, is by Ann Doe, our National Advisory Board member, Jung Park, who's one of our panelists, Debbie Trung, one of our board members, our treasurer, in fact, Summer Lin, and who's a panelist, and Cindy Chang, our deputy metro editor of the LA Times, who is moderating. So just to give you a quick taste of their stories, this one starts out, you can go ahead and read this on the screen yourselves, but I'll just go ahead and read maybe just the lead and the nut graph. Their motives for mass murder appear to be different. Workplace enmity, law enforcement officials said, or personal resentment, or a political conflict in homeland across the ocean. But they were all Asian men of retirement age, who within the past year have been accused of expressing their bitterness by spraying fellow Asians with bullets in the very places where Asian immigrants go to escape isolation. Okay, so, and one more snippet of this story. Among friends and family on social media, sons and daughters are anguishing over whether they were doing enough for elders who have been through so much, but often do not have the vocabulary to open up about problems, even in their native language. And as this person says, this is sort of a stoic bottling it up. This is the way, this is the cover, right? Let's let a few more people, admit a couple people, okay. And then now let's look at a few multimedia clips. This is just a really quick snippet of coverage from Natasha Chen at CNN, and then a quick audio, a clip of an audio story from Josie Huang. So let me just stop the share for a minute because, okay, let's start with Natasha's. And please let me know once I hit play, if the audio isn't working, someone just kind of let me know.
Mei Hua Huang used to dance at Star Ballroom and told me she couldn't believe such violence broke up a Lunar New Year party when this predominantly Asian American community was meant to be celebrating. I was shocked. I looked at the news media right away and suddenly I felt like my heart was so tight. How could something like this happen? So horrifying.
I hate to say this, but I'm really happy that it wasn't a racial, Asian hate. That is, for me, a relief.
Yet he and others tell me, how can there be any relief when so many are dead? They say something must change.
Natasha Chen joins us now. You're from San Mateo County, where one of the shootings happened. How are the tragedies affecting the Asian American communities across California?
Well, Anderson, both in San Mateo County, where I'm from, and here where I'm standing in LA County, there are large Asian American populations, strong cultural communities, people who love to share their culture and connect with each other. And they're doing that right now in mourning at a vigil. You're likely seeing images of that at Monterey Park City Hall, just a few blocks from where I'm standing. Now, you heard that man in my piece say that there's some form of relief because this wasn't an anti-Asian hate incident here, but there's also a complex feeling given that these two suspects seem to be men of Asian descent in their 60s and 70s. There's a sense of pain and bewilderment at what happened here. Why did they do this? Why did they attack members of their own community? And I don't just mean racial and cultural community. I also mean, in the case here in Monterey Park, his own dance community, his fellow dancers, a place where he met his ex-wife. In the case of Half Moon Bay, his own co-workers. And so the community is just left with a lot of questions, Anderson.
Yeah, Natasha Chen, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so let's listen to one more piece of work, a piece of coverage, just to give you a little idea of what these folks are covering. I'm going to play it without sharing screens because it's an audio piece by Josie Huang. So, and remember, it's edited. So I've edited it down to about a few minutes. So please let me know if you don't hear it, okay?
Josie Huang is a reporter for NPR member station KPCC. She covers Asian American communities in Southern California. Hi, Josie. Welcome.
Hi, Karen.
Josie, tell us about Lunar New Year festivities this weekend. How did that go?
Yeah, so Lunar New Year goes on for a couple of weeks, and this was the second weekend of festivals, and nothing was canceled. This is despite what happened in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay, or maybe it is because of what happened. These festivals this past weekend were a chance for people to salvage some of that hope, some of that sense of renewal that Lunar New Year is all about. So over in LA, Chinatown leaders, they went ahead with their Golden Dragon Parade. And in Orange County, there was the Tet Festival, which went on for 3 days. And then there was also this festival in the city of Alhambra that I went to. Alhambra is an LA suburb right next door to Monterey Park. It's also where the shooter tried attacking a second ballroom dance studio, but was thwarted by someone who works there, this 26-year-old person named Brandon Tsai. The Alhambra Festival organizers had a special ceremony honoring Tsai for his heroism, and that was a really big draw to the festival for folks. Even though it was cloudy and drizzly at times, I'd say overall the mood there was upbeat. Part of the main street was shut down so they could make room for booths, dozens of them, where you could buy novelty hats, roasted chestnuts, Korean barbecue. And there was a main stage where you could watch comics and traditional dancers.
And at this point, police hadn't released any information about the shooter. So nobody knew who this guy was or what their motivation was.
Totally, you're totally right. And you had public officials wondering aloud whether the shooting had been motivated by race. And it wasn't until later that day we found out that the shooter was himself Asian. It was a lot to take in. The shooting where an Asian shooter was targeting other Asians. And this was on top of the anti-Asian attacks during COVID. And this has put a lot of people on alert. I talked through this a little with a woman I met at a vigil last week. Her name's Tammy Cho, and she runs this nonprofit called Hate is a Virus, which is a group she co-founded in 2020 to address the surge in anti-Asian attacks. And she got emotional. She teared up, trying to talk about how she was feeling at the moment.
I think I'm still in the process of processing everything that has happened. But I think what I've come to realize that as much as I'm fearful of everything that's happening, sorry. Yeah, I think it's like moments like these, the opportunity to gather with our community, our friends, our loved ones, strangers that are also affected, to share this space and just be able to grieve with each other, has been really, really special.
So I hope that gives you a sense of the impact of their work. And so to get started, we have Cindy Chang, who's the Deputy Metro Editor of the LA Times. And she's going to lead us in a conversation about this. As I said, the second half of the program is reserved for your questions. So feel free to chat in the chat and ask questions in the chat. And Cindy will try to get to as many questions as she can after she moderates the panel. So thank you so much, Cindy, for being here.
Thank you, Julie. So let me start off by introducing the panelists. We have an amazing panel here, and I so look forward to what they have to say. Natasha Chen, you may know of her from watching CNN. She's a correspondent based in the LA Bureau. Prior to that, she was in Atlanta. Some of the big stories she's covered over the years include the 2021 Atlanta spa shootings and the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. She's originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, and earlier in her career, as is typical in the TV news business, she kind of did a tour of the country, starting in Killeen, Texas, moving to Memphis and then Seattle before landing at CNN. And we also have with us Josie Huang of the public radio station LAist, which was formerly known as KPCC and recently changed its name. She covers the intersection of being Asian and American and the impact of these growing communities in Southern California. She actually started her career in newspapers and then jumped to public radio, working for Maine Public Radio. And we also have with us two LA Times reporters. Summer Lin is a reporter for our Fast Break desk. That's a team that specializes in breaking news that we started a few years ago. She is originally from the East Coast, and she covered breaking news for the San Jose Mercury News before coming to the LA Times. And also from the LA Times, Jong Park, he covers Asian American communities. Full disclosure, he is one of my reporters. He was previously at the Sacramento Bee, where he covered economic mobility. He was born in Seoul and grew up in first Seoul and then Southern California. So those of us who covered the Monterey Park shooting, I think we will always remember where we were when we first heard about it or got the call from our editor. I had already gone to bed and nobody bothered me, but I woke up at like 5 a.m. to use the bathroom, and I saw in Slack that my boss had been up all night and was like, I'm turning in, here's where you guys should take it from here. And actually my first thought, because I didn't know at that point that Summer spoke Mandarin. So I was thinking, well, maybe no one else who speaks Mandarin couldn't go out there. So my first thought was I should go out there as an editor. As a reporter. And then, there was kind of like silence. I think they were like, you should just do your regular job. But so Natasha, where were you and what time was it when you got the call from your editor?
I was here in this apartment. I was woken up at 4 a.m. by one of our managers in the bureau. my parents had actually come to LA to visit me for Lunar New Year. We had plans the entire weekend to have dinners and meetups with their friends. And so, you know, in this small 1-bedroom apartment, if the phone rings, then everybody wakes up, right? So 4 a.m., it's me and my parents are now up and they're asking what's going on. And I tell them, "Yeah, it's a breaking news story. It seems like a lot of people have been hurt, possibly killed at a Lunar New Year celebration." And you could just see their faces. They're foggy, just like I am, and hurt by hearing that. And then my mom starts doing the Asian mom thing and starts packing me snacks. So like putting, you know, Chinese New Year pineapple cakes and stuff into a lunchbox because she knows I'm not going to eat today. But the phone call was about 4 a.m. My colleague had already been up overnight and they said, you need to get out to Monterey Park and you need to be on the air in 2 hours, which sounds like an okay amount of time until you factor in that I have to drive across LA because I'm on the west side. And you also have to, at that hour, get yourself camera ready with hair and makeup, and then also figure out what's going on, and also, you know, get there and make sure the logistics and everything are okay. So 2 hours was a real hustle for TV time to get there and be in front of the camera saying something that made any sense at all at that hour.
And Natasha, tell us a little bit about the rest of your day. How did you cover the story?
The beginning, as we all know, was pretty difficult to come by real concrete information for a while. And in television, especially in network cable TV, you're very much tethered to the camera setup, because for a 24-hour station, for a 24-hour channel, we are on the air pretty much every hour, especially with breaking news situations, sometimes multiple times an hour. So you can't really leave, which also makes finding a bathroom difficult. And I think there were a lot of people who were coming up to the media area, but you know, they also were a little bit hesitant to speak to media. I think that my colleague who was overnight had seen somebody who was a friend of some of the ballroom dancers reacting to the immediate you know, shock of the situation, and he was speaking in Mandarin only. I am the only Mandarin speaker among LA bureau staff at CNN. And so while I was going on air, I was also in between live shots trying to help translate some of the things that came in via audio, and just trying to make sense of it and trying to stay awake. And as everyone else on this panel did, trying to, you know, pace yourself with that energy level. And so that 4 a.m. call, I did get on the air at 6 and then did not get off the air until about 9 or 10 p.m.
Wow.
Don Lemon had flown in from New York to do some field anchoring, and he chatted with me live on the air, the two of us, as we are listening to the press conference and kind of digesting for our audience what we are learning from the press conference. So a lot of that breaking news situation, which CNN is so skilled at, is about not necessarily having the perfect article to present to you, but to really show the audience as you paint the fence, show the in progress work of your reporting. So that was a lot of that first day.
Josie, you had similar challenges, right? You had to go live pretty often throughout that Sunday as you were trying to gather information to be able to report what was going on.
Yeah, I actually had to play a lot of catch up because I'm usually a night owl, as I was telling you, Cindy, and so normally I would be up at that hour when the shooting occurred, but I actually, for some reason, went to sleep. I don't know, my body was like preparing me for what was the week that was coming, but I woke up not knowing, actually my husband woke me up probably around 6 a.m. to say what happened. And I was in such shock. I didn't even think about work. I was initially reacting kind of just as a person, an Asian American, and also
someone with little kids who were getting really, really excited about Lunar New Year celebrations, and that, you know, we had gone to get them new clothes for the holidays just like the day before. And so I had a very emotional reaction at first, but then I think I had to like collect myself and realize, oh crap, I'm going to be called on to, you know, just get it together and go out to the scene. And sure enough, I looked in the company Slack, and, you know, people had been discussing what'd been going on since last night. And so I got in touch with the executive editor who never sleeps, Megan Garvey, and I, you know, we just talked in shorthand. I think we knew that I was just going to head out to the first press conference of the day. I think there had been maybe some pressers the night before. And basically from that point onward, through, you know, out the day for the duration that we had broadcast, I was, you know, doing live hits on the hour, sometimes more than once an hour, and trying to sneak in some reporting in between. And then also doing a segment with our LAS's podcast, How to LA. And also I found out that I was supposed to do a feature for NPR that would run the next morning. And then I didn't know that at the time when I agreed to do something for BBC. So I just, very poor planning, but that was just everybody's first day, I think. It was pretty madhouse.
Yeah, so Jong, you did get a call late that night and headed out there. What did you do when you got to the scene?
Yeah, I got a call at 11:30 at night. I had a friend who lives in Monterey Park, so he actually identified the location for me. And I just headed straight out there. I think it took me 20 minutes to get to where the shooting happened, or near where the shooting happened. And we had, 4 or 5 people at the scene pretty much within the 20-30 minutes of me being there. I think I was the first one. And then we just kind of started to spread, across the area, trying to talk to whoever we can, trying to get whoever we can. Some went north, some went south, some went east, some went west. They set up a police line by the dance salon, but they did not set up a police line across the street. So I just walked in there and I found this owner of a seafood barbecue restaurant who was Korean and who described to me, and a photographer from the Chinese speaking newspaper who was there next to me just by coincidence, about what happened, describing the scene of how people rushed into his restaurant and told him to lock the door. And that proved to be really, helpful in understanding in the beginning what happened. And I think that showed the kind of gravity of kind of what went on. I also should note I was there at the Lunar New Year Festival before the shooting happened. So I was there about 6 o'clock, about 4 hours before the shooting. So I think I was wondering also as well, it's just related to the New Year celebration. And I think we realized into the night that thankfully it's not the case, but still, it was a lot of tragedy that we had to balance and we had to figure out how to report on. I think it just like Joji and Natasha, it was just a struggle to balance everything. I ran out of my phone battery. I had 2 phones, both of my phones went out of battery for somehow. And I had to do this thing for, BBC. So I had to run to my car at 3 a.m. to do that, and then come back to the press conference to, report what was going on. We also had trouble, getting the police to share any information until 3 a.m. in the morning. So that was supposed a lot of confusion and struggle for us as well. But all in all, I think, our coverage, and I think someone can tell us more a little bit later, I think our coverage that night, we tried our best, and I think we were able to tell, as accurately as we can about what happened that night.
Yeah, I think, although we don't have quite the same challenge as Natasha of having to speak live on the air with so many questions still unanswered. I mean, it's a similar challenge. At some point, you just have to say or write what you know in that moment. So Summer, you were also out there that first night. So what did you do when you got to the scene?
Yeah, so weirdly enough, I got a call around like 11:20, and I had fallen asleep because my partner and I had gotten so much Chinese food for Lunar New Year, and I just fell asleep after dinner. And I got, this call from my editor asking me to go down, and I, drove out of my garage, and they had blocked off my entire street because there had been a fire. And
Oh my God.
I know, and at that point, I was like, I mean, what's going on? And, there's so much going on at this one time. And so I actually took an Uber to Monterey Park from Hollywood from my apartment. And when I was in that Uber ride, I think that was actually pretty useful because I used the 20 minutes or so in the drive there to go on my phone, see media. I saw that some people were posting online who lived nearby the scene. And that was, very early, probably around like 11:40 or so. So, we were still trying to figure out if this had happened at the festival or not, if there were any eyewitnesses, and, just trying to get the basic details of what happened. So I was able to speak to a nearby resident who wasn't at the shooting, but he heard the gunshots. And he actually went down because he lives like maybe a block away. He went down to see because his fear was that it happened at the Lunar New Year festival. So he wanted to double check that it wasn't there. And he told me, everything was gone by then. It was completely cleaned up. So we, as far as he knew, it didn't occur there based on the timing. And then so I got there, and John was there, and a few other reporters, and a photographer was already at the scene. And similar to John said, we just kind of tried to fan out, tried to, figure out where we would be the most useful in the situation. I think one of our photographers, a photo editor, and another reporter, Rebecca Ellis, spoke to a guy near the press conference. I know there was like some confusion about like when the press conference was going to happen and where it was. But once they finally nailed down a location, there was a guy there who his sister had been at the dance studio that night with a couple of her friends. And he pretty much, he could speak some English, but mostly in Mandarin. So I was able to get there and ask him a few questions. And I kept his phone number, and a couple of days later, I checked in with him, and he said, I found out that my sister's two friends were two of the victims in the shooting. So just, those initial sources that we got ended up, playing an important role in future stories that we had. I unfortunately wasn't able to interview his little sister, but just knowing, his first reactions from hearing what had happened were very helpful to our initial coverage. And I think, we did the best we could. I think, I always think about what I could have done more at the scene, but at the time we were just trying to figure everything out like everyone else.
So hopefully after that first night, you and John got a little sleep before heading out the next day. In the meantime, the rest of the staff was figuring out what to do next, in addition to obviously nailing down, the facts of what happened and finding victims and victims' families. We also started to think about what kind of enterprise stories we could do. And I actually want to ask Anne about that, because she came up with a great idea for a story that we did on Sunday. Anne, do you want to talk about the story you did on Sunday?
Oh, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. I apologize for my voice, I have a cold. Cindy and I in casual conversation had been talking about how families celebrate the Lunar New Year. And my family's actually obsessed with it. We follow all sorts of tradition based on superstition. And I start cleaning the house really days ahead. Everything is sparkling, and I'm really afraid of evil spirits. So when this happened, Saturday night, I had been on the phone with our Metro editor, Hector, and he said, just hold on and think about what you could do for the next day. We already had people on the scene. So right away, I thought back of, did the shooter intend to pull the trigger on the biggest holiday of the year? This is a sacred day. And I knew that the Tet Parade was scheduled for the following day, and there's all manners of celebration up and down California. So talking to Cindy on the first day of the Lunar New Year, I suggested that we write about how people do not want to start a brand new year talking about death, but we're forced to. And how will that affect their lives? Are they afraid? Are they just going to continue as normal? And so I started doing the regular traditions with my family. We passed out the red envelopes. You know, we had the noodles, we had everything. We went to visit my father's gravesite. And in between, I made multiple calls, just asking all kinds of sources like, how are you guys handling this? Because it was amazing to me. It's like a mass shooting happening on Christmas Eve. This is a holiday that's celebrated by 2 billion people worldwide. And even last September, Governor Newsom signed legislation declaring Lunar New Year a state holiday. And I really wanted us to zero in on the moment.
Yeah, and it also shows how many of us who were covering this story were also in the middle of celebrating the holiday and had to put that aside as we were, trying to do our jobs. We had another reporter, Deborah Netburn, who just happened to be on a Sunday shift who covers faith and spirituality. So she was able to anchor that story, with the feeds that Anne got from her sources. Soon after, was it the Monday night or Tuesday? Monday night, or Monday, Half Moon Bay happened, and we found out that, that was also, the suspect was also an older Asian male. And that's when we put together the story that Julie spoke about in the introduction. So when I look at our panel, it's just very encouraging to see that we have Mandarin speakers on this panel. Jong is a native Korean speaker, Anne speaks Vietnamese. So I'll just throw this out to the group. How did being able to speak Mandarin help you cover this story?
I guess I'll chime in with something that was happening the night of Kamala Harris's visit. This was a few days after, and after she had gone and the Secret Service and her motorcade had left, there were a lot of people who came up to the, all the flowers that were laid out in front. I'm sure a lot of you who were covering this saw that. And a lot of you may have seen this one woman who knelt in front of the flowers and started wailing. And she was beside herself, upset. A lot of people were trying to make sense of what she was upset about, how she was connected to the victims. And it turns out she was from Hong Kong and spoke both Cantonese and Mandarin. And so there was someone near me who was speaking Cantonese to her. I was trying to speak a little bit of Mandarin to her to figure out, these were her longtime friends. She had been dancing with them for more than 10 years. She was supposed to have gone that night to the party. and stayed home instead because her kids, or her grown kids, were going out and she didn't want to leave the house unattended. And so she felt this incredible survivor's guilt. And none of this was in English, right? And just having moments like that, you know, we ended up deciding not to publish the video that I had on my cell phone of this, because she was so raw and there were so many cameras around her that it just was not, it felt she really just needed space. And but it was important that we could find out from her what she was feeling and thinking. And even, you know, people who were maybe a little bit hesitant kind of coming up to the memorial, you could sense that they maybe wanted to say something, but if they felt more comfortable in Mandarin than English, I think that was when it was important to have any of us who spoke Mandarin there to help out.
How about you, Josie?
Well, I guess you could say I'm a Mandarin speaker. I mean, I can get by. And, you know, I was thinking after one of the first press conferences, I made my way down to where, you know, the shooting had taken place, or actually as close as you could get, because for some of the folks on this call, you can probably remember there was a lot of like police barricades and tape. And honestly, there were more reporters downtown than actual residents or folks passing through. So there weren't that many people to talk to, actually. And so, you know, I saw a lot of reporters who I'm just assuming now that didn't speak Mandarin. And there were all these people around. I mean, there weren't that many people around, but the people that were around spoke Mandarin. And so I saw some of those reporters go up to those, try to talk to these folks, and they were like, just kind of wave them off and like, you know, I don't speak English well, you know, they could speak some English, but they weren't comfortable expressing themselves. But because I could communicate in Mandarin, I was able to get some interviews with folks. You know, this was while the manhunt was still going on, and to capture the you know, the tension and anxiety folks were feeling when this suspect was still on the loose, you know, where there wasn't a lot of time to go around trying to find an English speaker. I feel like knowing some Mandarin helped in that situation. You know, I remember talking to this one woman who's from China. She lived in neighboring Alhambra, if I'm correct, but she was downtown shopping for groceries. And when I talked to her, she had just heard from somebody else that there was something going on. And she basically was trying to talk to me to get some information. And I had explained to her that, you know, the helicopters atop were not police helicopters, rather like KTLA or something like that. But yes, I confirmed for her that they still didn't know where the gunman was. And, you know, she agreed to, I was recording her the whole time, but, you know, I was able to capture on my Marantz, my recording equipment, just her saying, I don't feel safe. I'm going home now, you know, and we were able to get that on air because that's something we've been striving to do at the station is, you know, put Spanish on, put Mandarin, Cantonese. And one thing is I wouldn't say I'm super fluent, but like I said, I can have a conversation, and I was able to paraphrase what she said. But so much of how she was feeling you could hear in her voice, and that's kind of the magic of audio and I think broadcast, right, is that you hear the person. So that's where it did come in handy. And actually I did 2 more interviews again that I try to squeeze in between having to do live hits, and I try to just, you know, get whoever was near me, and they all happened to be Mandarin speakers, and so we were able to get those other folks on air as well.
Yeah, and I mean, this obviously just shows how important diversity is in newsrooms, that we could talk to these people who otherwise wouldn't be able to express themselves in the media. Summer, you also interviewed people in Mandarin, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think, you know, what struck me was I feel like, you know, so many, especially like, you know, older immigrants in this community, you know, they probably haven't spoken to Western press before. And, you know, some of them may not be super comfortable doing so, and having to do that in a language you're not used to speaking, it's just, I think, you know, a very daunting task on top of, interviewing people who may have been traumatized by this event or, may not want to speak about this event. So I think just the general hurdles of, having to speak to survivors and families of victims is already a built-in challenge. And then, that language barrier, if you don't have someone on the scene, who can speak to them and or understand what they're saying is, I think that really speaks to the importance of having diversity in our newsrooms.
Mhm.
And I think, just it kind of breaks the ice a little more. I think, I think I pretty much saw every major media outlet out in Monterey Park those next few days, and just that overwhelming feeling of having so many people there trying to talk to people, and just some familiarity of, if someone could speak your language, they're more, comfortable and more prone to talking to you.
So you brought up something that I wanted to ask about, which is talking to victims and victims' families. What was your approach to that, considering what they had been through? And, I see, a lot of commentary on social media, like, how can reporters, do that? And so how do you approach it, and how do you justify it in your own mind, like why you need to, ask these questions?
I can start. I think that's, probably the toughest part of the job, at least for me, having to go to a family member who had just lost, a loved one is probably having the worst week of their life, and feeling like I'm intruding on their space, or, having to go to their house. And I just try to put myself in their shoes. And I think most people understand that you're, just doing your job. You want to get their story out there. And I also think, covering breaking news and crime in general, people react to grief very differently. Some people really want to share, everything about this person. They want everyone to know what this person was like, and they are very, forthcoming, and they want to talk about it. Others, don't grieve that way and don't really want to say anything to you, maybe ever. And just respecting, how people respond. If someone says no, I don't try to push them or anything. I ask, hey, if you want my number, here it is. If you never call me, that's totally fine. But just leaving that option for you if somewhere down the line you want to talk. And I think it's really tough. I think, for me, it's really worth trying to be like the first couple of reporters at the door knocking, because I, on top of having to, go to these people's houses, if you're maybe the 10th outlet to go there, you're, having these people say the same story, the same stuff over and over again. So I think for me, I just try to be as preemptive as possible and just try to get there as fast as possible, as to not put them through that for me.
Natasha, the same questions to you. And it seems maybe harder when you approach with, a camera and a crew. Maybe does it feel, more invasive than if you're just a reporter with a notebook like Summer?
Camera always changes everything.
Yeah.
It's a burden, and it's also our advantage, right? In being able to give our audience like this visceral connection to somebody, because they can see their face, they can see the emotions, and yet it requires such a willingness to be vulnerable in front of an audience. So I do, the door knocking, Summer, that you were talking about, I feel like I did so much more of that as a local reporter compared to a CNN national reporter, because local reporters are, really the first ones on the ground, every story across the country. And they're the first ones to approach people. I remember getting doors slammed in my face a lot. And yet, like you said, we are there to offer the opportunity for people who do grieve this way. I think the most important part of trying to reach a victim's family is to help them honor the person they just lost. For a lot of them, giving a public tribute is sort of the the greatest way they can honor their loved one. And if you have the diversity in your newsroom, the cultural competency there, I think it's important to have, people like who are on this panel do the communicating. And I'm thinking of the Atlanta spa shooting when I sat down with the daughter of one of the spa owners. And, a question that I ask I often ask a grieving person is, what do you want to say to the person who's no longer in front of you? And she said, I really want to give my mom a hug and tell her I love her. But that kind of hesitation that I saw in her expression, and she's from a Chinese family, I just took a little step and I said, can I guess that you didn't do that a lot? And she said, yeah, we were too shy. And you just know that the love language in Chinese families between mother and daughter is not the same as in Western culture. Then we're not going to use the L word, love. And hugging is sometimes not done. And love is shown through acts of service, of packing those snacks for you at 4 a.m. And so I think having the ability to connect with those victims' families in a way that where you show that you're kind of just there for them, I think is important. And sometimes if they never do a formal interview with you, hopefully you've helped them in some small way. One of the people who talked to me and this was a Mandarin speaker for this story in Monterey Park, his friend had been missing since that night. And we all know what that means. Like that's bad. And he didn't know where to go for resources. And I gave him the address that the city was giving out for victims' loved ones to go to. And then finally, unfortunately, he was not really in the loop with information coming out. And so I thought that he had known when the coroner put out names, but I inadvertently ended up being the person telling him that his friend had passed. And that was awful. You never want to do that. But again, it speaks to the importance of having people on staff who can communicate with these people.
Zhang, I know you weren't out there talking to the victims' families as much, but you did so many interviews on such a variety of stories. I mean, your byline has to be, I don't know how many stories your byline was on. So what are your thoughts on, just having to talk to so many people about this tragedy and how you approached it?
Yeah, it was, I think, a difficult conversation, even though, I didn't talk to as many families of the victims as Summer, Natasha, and Georgia did. I think something that I think a lot about is, the way that I approached it is, I think I thought about I think the term that I had heard is that you kind of do a sociology of the community after a mass shooting, which is unfortunate, but that's kind of how things work. So I think a lot about that. I think of what did this shooting tell us about our community? And I think about the past reporting, past interviews, past source meetings that I had with different community sources and different leaders, different activists, different just regular folks. And I think about what are some of the things that they have brought up in my reporting before the shooting that is relevant now. So that, for instance, speaks to the loneliness among seniors that we tackled a lot of in our coverage. I had heard a lot about that before the shooting from different community, Korean, Indian, Vietnamese, all different communities. And I was able to reach out to those sources who have already told me about those and ask them, unfortunately, the shooting has put those conversations into the forefront of people's minds. What should we know? What can you tell us about the situations that our elders face? So having done a lot of this reporting, source meetings, getting coffee beforehand helped a lot in terms of, me knowing who to go to, me knowing, how to reach out to those folks. Because they, have had those stats in their mind as well as we do. And we gave the opportunity for them to speak on those issues. Something else I think about also is the importance of ethnic media. We started in Atlanta, we started in Laguna Woods, we started in Monterey Park. I knew World Journal, which is the biggest Chinese language paper in the US. Their headquarters is in Monterey Park. So they've been putting out a lot of coverage. And from the first day, first night, I cannot read Chinese fluently when I'm taking class, but I knew enough to go to the World Journal, see what's out there, and flag things here and there to Summer and Cindy and people who can speak Chinese, who can read Chinese. And I think that was also very important for us to be aware of the discussion happening in that language, in that community, in that world. I think we'll note later, but we ultimately partnered with World Journal to produce a Chinese language profile of the 11 victims of the Monterey Park shooting, which I think was really important, crucial way that we get our story told and we hear from and we talk to those communities. So I think those are something that I have kept in mind, I think.
Yeah, no, it just shows how important it is for us to come in with an understanding of the communities we cover. And of course, on this panel, some of it comes from our own background and experience, but both Josie and Zhang and Anne, I mean, your beat is Asian communities. So it also comes, like Zhang said, from talking to your sources over the years and being able to put together your understanding of the community with this event in a deep way, not just kind of a surface way. And so that brings me to the last question I want to ask before we open it up to audience questions. The Monterey Park shooting in Half Moon Bay, this happened in your community. And so of course you bring insight to it, but it's also a lot of responsibility that, that you're the one who understands it. Your colleagues are coming to you with questions about, their stories or what they want to do. And it's so close to you. And Summer wrote this amazing first person piece about covering the shooting in her community. And so Summer, do you want to start off by telling us about your piece and your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I think, when I was reporting and, I think I had covered I hadn't covered mass shootings, but I had covered other violent crimes, had, door knocked plenty of times before as a local journalist. But it just felt different this time, I think, because I did feel so connected to the people I was talking to, even though, I didn't know who they were. And, even if we talked for a couple minutes, I just felt like, I could really put myself in their shoes, or I thought about my own family members as I was doing reporting. And I think, that helped me be a little bit more empathetic and just, trying to see them as human beings first. And I always try to lead with that anyway, but I think especially when it comes to your own community, you can't help but think, oh man, so many of these dancers were, in their 50s, 60s, or 70s, or, what if, that had been my grandparents who were, there, and, it's so many of the commonalities and, just having that cultural tie, I think just made it feel a lot more personal reporting on it. Versus, other shootings that I have covered or other stories that I've done. And yeah, I think, having other reporters and other journalists come to you with those questions, I always appreciated it because, I wanted to help out. I wanted to, put out accurate information. I wanted to make sure that we were translating stuff correctly, or I wanted to make sure, we put out the best coverage that we could. So I didn't mind being asked, or I didn't mind helping out or pitching in. I just thought more of, I just want to make sure we do the best stories that we can, if that makes sense.
Josie, the piece that Julia played a clip of at the beginning of the panel, I mean, that was such a wonderful piece. And you went on in the piece to explain really what Monterey Park is and what it means to the Asian community. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I, just kind of going off what Summer was saying about mass shootings and it affecting you personally, I feel like I've been reporting for over 20 years now and covered my share of mass shootings and feel like everyone gets me. Even in, I guess like I cover San Bernardino, but even the ones I don't cover, like Uvalde or Atlanta, I'm just I don't know. I think I'm getting weepy in my old age, and it just it just feels like a lot sometimes. But I think with Monterey Park, there was this responsibility because a lot of eyes were looking at us in LA and at me for in the public media world to explain what Monterey Park was in the way that folks had to explain, local reporters in Uvalde had to explain what this small town meant to the folks there. And Monterey Park is nowhere as small as Uvalde, but outside of Asian America and Southern California, a lot of people don't know about Monterey Park. And so I got the chance to explain to folks, on NPR and on the show Code Switch, what Monterey Park is and how the folks there are like, join the club nobody wanted to join, and how they, they just can't fathom it, and just be able to explain to, because I feel like a lot of media that wasn't from there, from, the reporters who weren't here were just describing, Monterey Park as this like, Asian majority place. And that's all true, but it's just also, there's so many more dimensions to Monterey Park. The other third is Latino, for instance. And, it is a combination of immigrants, but also the second and third gen folks who are there. And it was, a chance to say that Monterey Park is part of a big constellation in the San Gabriel Valley, right? That there's like 10 Asian majority communities that this is part of. And it's not just affecting Monterey Park, but, commerce, culture, that all flows all over San Gabriel Valley. And so it broke people's hearts in Monterey Park, but also outside of Monterey Park. And, part reporting for this segment, I didn't speak to so much the victims, but just the people who love the San Gabriel Valley and Monterey Park. And I was pretty astounded to meet all these people like at the vigils who are not, didn't grow up in the San Gabriel Valley, but, came from the Midwest, maybe for Hollywood to like get into the industry. And for them, like when they discovered Monterey Park, it was like mind blown because they grew up in places like I talked to some guy from Overland, Kansas, and another person from Cincinnati. And they were just saying like, oh my God, their heart, they just like I think the guy I talked to from Cincinnati was saying like he used to go to Monterey Park like all the time to kind of make up for all that he lost as a child, growing up in a place where he was, trying to fit in with the white majority. So Monterey Park has so much meaning, not just for the residents there, but just I think for so many people who moved to LA. I'm originally from the East Coast and, all my extended family is here, but like, for me, Monterey Park is extremely special and very different from how I grew up in Maryland and in Taiwan, where Maryland, I was in the minority. In Taiwan, I was like, with all these other Asians and no one, even noticed me. But like Monterey Park is a special place where it's like Asian majority, but Asian majority, Asian American, if you know what I mean. It's not like Asia, it's just like there's nowhere else really like it. I guess there's some other places that are comparable in Southern California, but it's like an only in California kind of place. So anyways, that was the responsibility I felt trying to explain to our listeners nationally. Monterey Park is more than just a name or just like this place on a map where there was another mass shooting.
Yeah, you did such a good job on that. I'm gonna start in on some of our audience questions, which Anne has texted to me. So I'll start out with a couple that I have on my phone, but you guys should keep on putting more questions in the chat. We have like half an hour left, so it's plenty of time. So here's a question from Betty. I'm wondering how things have changed for you all as individuals and or in your newsroom since covering this story. Having covered Sandy Hook myself and coaching trauma now, there's a reality that our reporting experiences really impact our inner lives. Who wants to take that one?
I guess if no one's talking.
Go ahead, Natasha.
I'm trying to unmute myself, but you go.
Oh,
Naga-
go. You go.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that at work, we have an AAPI Peeps Slack channel, which sadly is relatively new, but it was just like so essential. I think, Christine, I think you're on here. She's our social head. Like, it was a place where we kind of leaned on each other and try to check in with each other. And like, I think I remember people posting their favorite treats to, say, hey, how are you guys getting through this right now? And then just like posting pictures of delicious treats you can only get at H Mart. And so I think in that sense, like it kind of brought a lot of us together. And, and if I can just use this opportunity to say that, I think a lot of people at the station and elsewhere, like thought I was doing a lot of the coverage, but I really wasn't, because I got so focused on doing this like segment for NPR. But I mean, there were so many other AAPI reporters who pitched in, and I don't know if they're on this call, but like LAU should report on the shooter and the latest developments, along with Mike Rowe, Caitlin Hernandez. Phoenix Toe she was reporting from the Victim Resource Center. In fact, we were both there at the same time and didn't see each other. Stephanie Retoper, Brianna Lee were all doing, support from within. Michael Flores and Robert Garova were, reporting on mental health in Asian American communities. Mariana Dale, she reported on the ballroom culture and the SGB. So, I mean, thankfully it wasn't just me, because it would be like really slim pickings. But it was in terms of, going back to the original question, how we got through this mental health wise, I think there were the mental health counselor was offered to us. And it was very difficult to actually take advantage of it, because her hours were kind of during the workday when we were all on deadline. But I think they did try to adjust the hours a little bit. And I was able to, just talk to somebody, and there was another staffer on call, and we were just able to just kind of, take stock of everything. So that was somewhat helpful. I don't know. It was a release valve of some sort. So.
And Natasha, you were going to address the question as well.
Unfortunately, having been in 3 local TV markets before CNN, and then, over the past dozen plus or so years, there have been, I cannot count the number of mass shootings now that I've been at. And has it changed me? I think yes, as any series of stories would, but in this particular genre, if you will, I remember my very first one, November 5th, 2009, Fort Hood. And the Army psychiatrist had shot, I think, 13 people. And I was a baby reporter. I had been on the job 6 months, and I did not even have an IFB, the earpiece where you can talk to people back in the booth or to the anchors. So I was cut off from information coming in. And, I was dressed the wrong way to go cover this. I was in heels. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And the impact of that first one, of thinking of the panic that people were experiencing, the people around me who were gathering, frantic about their loved ones, somebody who told me that they felt relieved that their spouse was safer in Afghanistan than here at home right now. I mean, those things will stay with me. And I think that first one really shook me. And then like these things do, the more there are of them, the more they all start to blend together. And especially the school ones. And we have to remember, which one was that? And what city was that again? And as I was saying to somebody in the chat, at the very least, there is an expectation of what the coverage work is going to look like. We know that we're not going to sleep for several days. We know what kind of angles we need to chase. We know what kind of emotional response, for the most part, we're going to see. That helps to at least remove the surprise factors from the work, but it doesn't mean that it gets any easier. And especially as this story and the Atlanta spa shooting for me were so closely impacting the community that I belong to, that became a whole other factor. I think that I was telling you, Cindy, that the Atlanta spa shooting, I think, was even more of a burden for me than Monterey Park. And that's because of some of the things that Josie just said. We're describing Monterey Park and the San Gabriel Valley as this place that is this constellation of such a strong Asian American community where there is this support system. And yes, you are explaining this community to the rest of the world. But in Atlanta, these victims were Asian women, almost all of them, in a place that did not have the kind of strong Asian minority that we have in California. So I found myself having to sort of ask questions and fight for angles and fight for debates that, you know, were not obvious to perhaps most of the audience there, or perhaps even the newsroom. That the whole idea in that mass shooting that this guy was, quote, having a bad day, if some of you remember that. CIO, or that the guy it was just a sexual addiction. I felt the responsibility to have to flag like, hey, there is a problem with the hypersexualization of Asian women. This goes back in history and like, so I felt like I was kind of swimming upstream with that story. And at the very least, as tragic as Monterey Park was, I felt like there was such a gigantic community hug happening at the same time.
Right. And there was that person in your piece who said, I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm glad it wasn't a hate crime, at least.
Yeah. How do you even describe that?
Yeah.
Like, an adjective for that feeling, right?
Yeah.
There's no good shooting.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So there's a related question from Victoria Lim that zeroes in on kind of how you guys have been taking care of yourself. I mean, Josie, you were saying that there was a counselor available, but like you were working. I mean, you were covering this breaking story, but you know, now some time has passed. Have you been able to tend to your wellness and health, mental, physical, emotional, and otherwise? How did you take care of yourself?
Well, I was, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say really quickly, I was getting teary just listening to Natasha. So obviously I'm a mess. So anyways, go Joe.
I mean, yeah, I think I just, you know, I was getting, I never really get nightmares or dreams, but I got a nightmare about the shooting about a few days into our coverage. So, you know, I could tell that it left kind of an imprint on me. I mean, I think for me, it helped me a lot that I had a friend, really close friend, in Monterey Park, just, you know, I think half a mile away from where the shooting happened. And it really helped me that I could just like call him up, and we were just getting dinner and we were just getting lunch, you know, not for work. You know, we were just kind of, I would be out there reporting and I would just call him up and, hey, let's get boba, let's get dinner. And we would just go for, you know, meal. That really helped a lot. You know, I think just kind of when that rush of adrenaline kind of wears off and you have to figure out, okay, like, you know, having like a day or having a few moments to kind of just collect yourself is really key. Because once you're just kind of, you know, you're going to go all the time in the beginning, but once that adrenaline wears off, that's when it really hits you. So thinking about, you know, and remembering how to like pace yourself, remembering when to take a few moments, I think that was really key for me.
Unfortunately,
yeah, for me as an editor also, it was like, I mean, I told both you and Anne, I mean, you know, yeah, obviously put in all your hours and get overtime, but you also actually need to take, you know, days off. That's the only way to do it. Yeah.
I was going to say, unfortunately, I had been dealing with some outside of work things at the same time that week. It just all piled on at the same moment. When it rains, it pours. And there was a death in my family at the same time, completely unrelated to these shootings. And so I just had to take off. Like after the majority of the story was, after the peak had happened. And I think having managers who recognize when you need to take some time off is really key. And I'm grateful for having bosses who get that.
And you were also telling me that you were supposed to be spending this time with your parents, and your dad lives in Taiwan.
Oh,
so you
yeah,
don't see him that often. So you lost the time with them because you were working 24/7 on this.
Oh, they left. They left. They were like, we're not going to see you anyway. So we'll catch you later.
Okay, there's a question from Billy, and I think we addressed most of this. Is the spa shooting in Georgia related to the current mass shootings on Lunar New Year in respect to hate crimes? I mean, Natasha talked about the complexity of that, the Atlanta situation, and I mean, this Monterey Park, and I mean, as our story said that Julie mentioned, Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay seemed to be, although the motive is not totally clear, kind of personal issues and Asian on Asian, and then the shooting at the Taiwanese church in Laguna Woods, even though, that was Asian on Asian, I mean, he was charged with hate crimes because it was this, the complex ethnic politics of Taiwan. Even though he grew up in Taiwan, he was targeting specifically Taiwanese people because of, his hatred of them. Okay, another question from Emily Kwong. I would love to hear the panelists share what follow-up coverage they want to see and unanswered questions they have about these shootings. I hope that at the LA Times we've been able to execute people's ideas for follow-ups, but any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think the big thing that Anne and I and Cindy and all of us, we think a lot about is elder care, right? What does this say about, the health and mental health of our elders? I think that will be, and that has been already, I think the big topic of discussion, and that will continue to be a big discussion going forward.
And in fact, we will be digging into that. Anyone else? Anyone else have thoughts on that question? All right. Okay, question from AJ. How do you hold back your tears when you're covering something that impacts you? It says exponentially, but I think they mean emotionally, or exponentially or emotionally, well, whatever the case is.
I can chime in if
sure.
Yeah. I would say, yeah, a lot of, I mean, for me, I think doing these interviews, kind of what Natasha said, once you cover so many tragedies, unfortunately, you start to kind of get used to it, for lack of a better term, or they somewhat become more routine because it's part of your job. But for me, sometimes I just end up tearing up. I can't really help it or stop it if it happens. And I've never had a source or a subject get upset that I was feeling what I was feeling during the moment. But sometimes I'll just go to my car after a really bad interview and start crying, and just having to let that out in some cathartic way. We're all human beings too, and we all feel these horrible things that we've been reporting on, and in hearing so many of these people's stories, I think you can't help but to empathize and feel that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of us who become reporters, although it's a fine line to maintain the empathy, yet you have to have some detachment, to get through these situations, and also to, cover the story, without, being, you have to have a little bit of distance. So it's something that we're constantly navigating. Teresa asks, for reporters who don't speak Mandarin or the language of the community being covered, what tips do you have for communicating?
I mean, I guess, since I don't speak Mandarin, I cover the lahat of what happened. I mean, I think I would just again say, reading ethnic paper, using Google Translate to at least kind of get a gist of what was being discussed in that community helps. But sometimes I would ask, do you have somebody who can, do you have a family, friend, or relative near you who can help translate? I could ask that. Sometimes, yeah, I think that's kind of what I do most of the times when I have a face this language barrier. Um, it's to kind of just ask for, is there somebody who can help us?
Yeah, you have to be resourceful. Sometimes it does entail grabbing the person next to you, although that's not ideal.
Yeah, because I'm often in Jung's situation where I'm, like, for instance, trying to talk to someone for whom Korean is their primary language, and obviously I can't speak Korean, so I would also maybe, it's tricky because there's different nonprofits that maybe are working with some of these individuals, and like it's ideally you could have an interpreter who's got no skin in the game, so to speak, but that's very expensive and not something you can beckon at just like a drop of a hat or anything like that. So yeah, that's what I've had to do in the past, is just rely on folks in the community, people who work in the community. When there's been times I needed things translated, I will lean on my friends or their parents. For instance, we were trying to do like a pronouncer for the victims, including one individual's name who's a Cambodian victim, and so I knew some Khmer speakers, and so then I called one up and asked, can you help me? And they basically just did a voice memo and sent it. And I shared it with our newsroom to make sure that we could get the pronunciation correct. But it's a lot of just kind of, hodgepodge, trying to cobble something together. When the money, ideally news organizations would be able to front the money to pay for a professional interpreter.
Right. But like you said, even if there's the money, it's just, it's logistically, it takes some time to set up. And with breaking news, you don't have time for that. Maybe for a longer term story, you can set it up.
Yeah.
Okay. Question from Dennis. When you're covering heavy events like these, how do you find the balance between asking loaded questions to get in-depth info and not being super invasive and hurting these victims even more? Somebody want to take that one?
I think it's all about approach. You really are, it is our job, and the responsibility to tell the story well requires asking some of these loaded questions. But it's about, I think, knowing when to ask those questions and in what tone and in what setting. If you're, noticing, for example, that the woman is wailing in public in front of the flowers, now is not the time to be asking her, her thoughts on gun regulation. Like, this is, you just read the room, right? And so you kind of over time come to understand when someone is in a position where they can accept even listening to that question. And oftentimes I think it is much easier for all parties if the interview is being done in a private setting. I think that the interviews that are being done at the scene when there are tons of people around, and then you got a lot of cameras swarming around the same person, that can be really tough because that person is going to feel ambushed. So if there's a way that you develop a relationship or even like a positive communication with somebody where they're willing to set up a time with you to sit down, that's the most ideal.
This question from Tim is sort of conceptual. How do we define the term Asian in order to cover the Asian community? I mean, for this story, we were really covering the story, right? But, I think that, in Zhang and Anne's beat, I mean, actually, I've had conversations with Zhang, like geographically, where does this beat stop? And we used to have a reporter who kind of covered, let's say, some of the Middle Eastern immigrants, but it's like, where do we stop it? Afghanistan, do we, where do we stop? And then how do we prioritize? Yeah, there are communities that have the highest population, right? Like Filipinos, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, but like, how do we cover all of these communities? I mean, it's a huge challenge.
I'm so glad this question was asked because I think it's a really good reminder of how diverse this community is as well. I mean, it's easy to say Asian or AAPI, but that covers so many different cultures. And I also want to make a quick note that I have observed that even among Asian American reporters, there is a diversity in how we are reacting to some of these stories because of how we grew up. I think someone mentioned that, there are folks who grew up on the East Coast who did not grow up with this sort of like majority minority feeling. Whereas I was very lucky to grow up in a community where there were a lot of people who looked like me and hundreds of other students at Saturday Chinese school. So it just was a completely different emotional response for me than I think some of my Asian colleagues, Asian descent colleagues, in covering of these stories, multiple stories that involve Asian Americans. I think it's important to remember that we're not all going to react the same way.
A question from Kevin. I thought the follow-up coverage touched on many important things, but I'm curious if the panel knows or thinks these stories ever get read by the community affected. Do you try to share your stories with sources? I can start with this one because, I think Summer alluded to the fact that we translated some of our stories into Chinese. And it was really a team effort. A lot of people were involved, and we heard some outside translators. And the one we started with was our in-depth profiles of the victims. And at some point during that process, I asked, and honestly, I'm not sure if people have really thought about it, how are we going to get those stories to Chinese readers? Because if we just stick them on the LA Times website, like those people aren't going onto our website. And so that's when I had known an editor at the World Journal, the Chinese newspaper, for years. And I thought, well, and they sometimes translate our stories into Chinese and run them in the paper, and they give us credit. And I thought, well, what if we partner with them? At least we can get it to their readers, in addition to, thinking like, well, some of us have good community contacts, so we definitely want to like share it on our social media and encourage other people to share, right? But this partnership was a way to get these stories to the World Journal readers. And, because we ultimately want them to know these details about the victims that we had reported. And I mean, World Journal is, a really vital publication for Chinese immigrants, but they don't have the same resources we do to go into the same depth. So if their readers could read, the reporting that we did, I mean, we really wanted that to happen. And at the same time, we realized that translation wasn't enough. We had to copy edit these stories in Chinese, and your Chinese has to be just really at a high level to be able to catch mistakes. So then we asked the World Journal to copy edit, so that way we got free copy editing, but also the stories would meet their standards, so they could publish it in their paper. And so, I think that worked out really well. And I hope that we can do more of those partnerships in the future.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think Anne said this about me in the chat in the beginning, but I do a weekly appearance on Radio Korea, which is the biggest Korean language radio station in the US. based in Koreatown here in LA. And I was able to share some of our stories, some of our coverage in Korean to that audience who are mostly first generation, elders. And, I also have a good relationship with the Korean language newspapers. So, and I see that they rewrote some of the stories that we worked on. So I think just keeping that relationship with all these ethnic media outlets helped a lot to get our stories out there.
Okay, well, our timing is impeccable. I don't see any more questions, and it's 8:30. So amazing. We packed a lot in. This was such a great conversation. Thank you to all the panelists and the audience for sticking with us and asking great questions.
And thank you, Cindy. You did a wonderful
Sure.
job moderating the discussion.
Thank
you all
you.
so much. Have a great night. Watch
Thank
out
you.
for our health justice programming and some other events coming up in the next month or so. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Where's the leave button?